Chapter 4. Let us not follow where the path may lead. Let us go instead where there is no path and leave a trail. Japanese proverb. Drink life to the lees. The Explorer. I ate a tarantula last winter. It was coated in tempura batter. Nevertheless, it was a tarantula with all those hairy legs. I didn't eat the whole thing, just the head end. The rest I left on my plate. That same evening, I also ate a scorpion, a sliver of alligator, some bear meat, and a few bites of kangaroo. Somehow I missed the rattlesnake, yak, South American rat, Indonesian cockroach, and turtle. And I passed on the worms. Worms I could not do. Even in a canapé, a worm is a worm. What was I doing? Well, I was dressed in my white evening dress, wearing my bear claw necklace with 21 claws that I had bought years earlier while living on the Navajo Indian Reservation in Arizona. And like several hundred others dressed in black tie, I was attending the annual gala of the Explorers Club at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. There we all stood, among the crystal chandeliers, thick red carpets, and flowing champagne, eating exotic hors d'oeuvres. For me, it was a once-in-a-lifetime event. Never again. I'm an explorer, but tarantula hors d'oeuvres? The only thing that saved me was that I wasn't wearing my glasses. The Sensation Seekers. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Robert Frost's great poem has touched millions, perhaps because it invites us to reflect on our life decisions, triggering feelings of wistfulness. But to take the path less traveled by is also mysterious, adventurous, and exciting to an explorer. I understand this type. Someone once said to my twin sister, "You're the only person I know who could get excited when your car gets a flat tire." Not all explorers get excited by a flat, of course. Some strike out from Mount Everest, the Amazon, or another exotic realm. These people seek the thrills of physical adventure. Some teeter on the brink of bankruptcy as they invent the newest widget. Some gravitate to wild sex, gambling, alcohol, or street drugs. They like being out of control. Some revel in bizarre music, exotic art, counterculture or social activities, or avant-garde ideas. And many simply collect stamps or antiques, stay home and read, or take advantage of every theater, movie, or musical event in town. Explorers seek adventures of the mind and senses. Such was Helen Keller, a woman who overcame severe disabilities to explore the world. Born in 1880 and stricken by a fever at the age of 19 months that left her blind and deaf, Helen turned into a savage little tyrant, staging tantrums for attention, sulking and rocking in her bed. She once locked her mother in the pantry for 3 hours as she sat gleefully on the porch steps, relishing the vibrations of her mother's pounding on the pantry door. As she later wrote of her early childhood, "I was strong, active, and indifferent to the consequences. I knew my own mind well enough, and always had my own way, even if I had to fight tooth and nail for it." This would change when 21-year-old Anne Sullivan came to work with Helen, then age 7, at her home in Tuscumbia, Alabama. Sullivan was a disciplinarian. When Helen threw a tantrum at the breakfast table to scare her off, hurling food and herself around the room, Anne leaped on Helen and held her down. But the new teacher had more than fortitude. She had grown up in a poorhouse in Massachusetts and supported herself and her brother, working with the blind and deaf. She was proficient in American Sign Language, and as soon as she arrived at the Keller household, she began to train the unruly child. Every time Helen touched an object, Anne grabbed her other hand and spelled out on her palm in sign language the English word for the object, DOLL. HATCUP, until Helen's aha moment finally arrived. Years later, Helen recounted this experience. We walked down the path to the well house, attracted by the fragrance of the honeysuckle with which it was covered. Someone was drawing water, and my teacher placed my hand under the spout. As the cool stream gushed over one hand, she spelled into the other the word water, first slowly, then rapidly. I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motion of her fingers. Suddenly I felt a misty consciousness, as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that WATER meant that wonderful, cool something that was flowing over my hand. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, set it free. Helen Keller was a true explorer. This tall, passionate, and poetic woman went on to graduate from Radcliffe College, write several books and many articles, and fight for women's suffrage, the blind, workers' rights, and birth control. She spoke to thousands and met every American president from Grover Cleveland to Lyndon B. Johnson. As she wrote, life is either a daring adventure or nothing. Dopamine, the chemistry of sensation-seeking. Explorers express a constellation of traits. They are intensely curious and unusually creative. They are restless, energetic, and spontaneous, often impulsive. They are willing to risk a great deal to pursue their many interests, and they get bored easily when not absorbed in something that intrigues them. They tend to be optimistic, irreverent, and autonomous. Explorers are adaptable. They can play many different roles. Most are liberal in their political views, flexible in their personal lives, and generous with their money, time, and ideas. And explorers crave novelty. All pleasure consists of variety, wrote Samuel Johnson. Explorers believe it. They search for new experiences, a trait that psychologists call novelty-seeking or sensation-seeking. And although they are not necessarily fond of risk, they're willing to take risks to enjoy new, intense, and exhilarating adventures. In my personality type study, only explorers overwhelmingly agreed with this statement, "I find unpredictable situations exhilarating." This sensation-seeking disposition is largely inherited. In fact, some of the contributing genes involved have been discovered. A gene labeled DRD4 controls much of the dopamine activity in brain regions used for thinking, feeling, and motivation. And a specific version of this gene is associated with several varieties of novelty-seeking. Old or young, male or female, rich or poor, educated in the ivory tower or on the mean streets, people who have inherited this gene in the dopamine system have an appetite for variety. Dopamine acts in tandem with several other chemicals, of course, including the closely related norepinephrine and lesser players such as testosterone and serotonin. So if you are describing yourself on a dating site or in the personals and hope to impress a doctor or endocrinologist, you might compose your essay thus. I am a, year-old male-female with elevated activity in the mesolimbic dopamine system, low MAOB on my blood platelets, high circulating testosterone, low serotonin in many limbic regions, and low norepinephrine in my cerebrospinal fluid. But to keep it simple, just say, I'm an explorer. In my personality type study of 39,913 anonymous members of Chemistry.com, 26% were explorers. Some 27% of men were explorers, while 25% of women were explorers. This is a very small, but statistically significant difference. More men were explorers. But had I been able to give a longer test to measure more of the ways women explore, by reading, attending cultural events, and traveling to exotic places, for example, I suspect I would have found just as many women. Nevertheless, the explorers I studied have much in common. Among these traits, both male and female explorers would prefer to live in America's big cities, where the action is. Boredom susceptibility. Any idiot can face a crisis. It's this day-to-day living that wears you out, wrote the Russian playwright Anton Chekhov. Not only do explorers seek novelty, they are poor at tolerating boredom. They experience what psychologists call boredom susceptibility. Repetitive experiences, routine jobs, tedious companions exasperate them. In fact, many explorers like interruptions. These diversions energize them. Explorers avoid monotony at almost any cost. One famous explorer was the American President John F. Kennedy. As the former White House correspondent Nancy Dickerson said of him, you could do anything to him, steal his wallet, insult him, argue with him, but to bore him was unpardonable. Probably many explorers would agree with JFK on this point. In my personality type study, only explorers responded enthusiastically to the statement, I get bored when I have to do the same familiar things. You can see this mental state in an explorer's doodles. Doodling is the brooding of the hand, wrote artist Saul Steinberg. Indeed, the explorers I studied were significantly more likely than other personality types to choose abstract, free-flowing, asymmetrical, open designs that suggest action and movement. Designs characteristically made by individuals who express a great deal of dopamine activity. Intense and sustained energy. I cannot rest from travel. I will drink life to the lees. So spoke Ulysses in Tennyson's great poem, named for the fabled Greek warrior and wanderer. Intense energy is another core trait of the explorer. Ernest Hemingway was a man with extreme energy. He ran with the bulls in Pamplona, hunted lions on the Serengeti plains of Africa, caught marlin off Key West, Florida, and was one of the most daring war correspondents of his time. How did Hemingway have the energy to do all this and write some of the greatest fiction of the 20th century? With dopamine. Explorers abound in it. In my personality type study, explorers were significantly the most likely to respond positively to the statement, I have more energy than most people. Explorers were also the most likely to go dancing, see a live band, or host a party, and the least likely to see a movie at home. Despite her enormous physical handicaps, Helen Keller rode, canoed, swam, hiked, danced, and rode horseback. In fact, passers-by used to gawk at her with amazement as she galloped by them in New York City's Central Park. She played chess and checkers. She went to museums, the theater and art shows, and she read voraciously, as she put it, in the happy-go-lucky way I love. One of Keller's biographers, Dorothy Herman, wrote of her, Helen's immense vitality amazed and touched everyone who knew her. Greatly elevated dopamine and norepinephrine activity, in conjunction with other brain aberrations, can also produce hypomania, mild mania, or full-blown mania. Psychiatrist K. Redfield Jamison vibrantly described her childhood hypomania in her book An Unquiet Mind. I found myself, in that glorious illusion of high summer days, gliding, flying, now and again lurching through cloud banks and ethers, past stars and across fields of ice crystals. I remember singing, Fly Me to the Moons, as I swept past those of Saturn. Helen Keller wrote of her frenetic childhood fantasies, too, but unlike Jameson, who would descend into full-blown mania in her 20s, Helen was blessed with an exceedingly active yet well-balanced mind. Impulsivity. He who hesitates is lost. Explorers believe it. Generally speaking, explorers are also impulsive and uninhibited. Builders keep themselves in check to do their duty. Directors are monitored by logic and reason. And negotiators often restrain themselves for ethical reasons. But for explorers, waiting is slow death. Their cravings overwhelm them, and they leap for what they want. Explorers in my personality type study responded particularly enthusiastically to the statement, I do things on the spur of the moment. This disinhibition is directly related to the activities of dopamine. Women, even little girls, exhibit a little less of this impulsivity, as a particularly fiendish test illustrated. Girls and boys as young as 3 were asked to hold a piece of candy on their tongue for as long as possible before chewing, sucking, or swallowing it. The little girls showed more restraint. No matter what your sex, however, if you have inherited the explorer's disinhibition, you are more likely than other types to enjoy smoking, alcohol, drugs, gambling, risky sex, or some other sort of spontaneous, exhilarating behavior. Helen Keller described this love of letting go when she went tobogganing. What joy! What exhilarating madness! For one wild, glad moment we snapped the chain that binds us to the earth, and joining hands with the winds, we felt ourselves divine. Daring feats, spontaneous retorts, last-minute plans, moments of intellectual discovery. Explorers express their spontaneity in many ways. One impulsive moment probably changed the course of modern Russia. In 1991, hardline Soviet leaders had launched a coup against the liberalizing President Mikhail Gorbachev while he was vacationing in the Crimea. In a flash of impulsivity, Boris Yeltsin, then a government official and later the president, leaped onto a tank and made an impassioned speech. His words rallied Russian troops to support Gorbachev and smash the coup, and helped to fuel the struggle to modernize Russia. I wonder how many other explorers have played pivotal roles in our deep human history. The creative drive. I am more creative than most people. The personality type studies showed that explorers were far more likely than other types to strongly agree with this statement, be it poetry, music, literature, sculpture, speech-making, sharpshooting, theater, cooking, the mechanical industrial arts, or the art of the business deal. Explorers often create as naturally as eagles fly. Known as the creative drive, this creativity was recently measured by a curious test. Participants were asked to solve a series of anagrams, scrambled letters that can be arranged to form words. Among them was the anagram M, P, X, A, E, L, E. What word do you think this is? The answer is example. Now the question. Did you solve this anagram by systematically trying out different letter combinations? Or did you have an aha moment when the answer suddenly became clear to you? If you came to this solution with sudden insight, psychologists report you tend to be more creative. Equally interesting, those who solved this anagram by sudden insight and those who arrived at the answer by methodical analysis also show different patterns of brain activity. I suspect they have different activities in the dopamine system, too. Erich Adickes, an early 20th century German philosopher, called creative people innovators. Helen Keller was highly creative with words and images. Describing some of her times at the seashore, she wrote, "I thought it great fun to sit on a big rock in my bathing suit and feel wave after wave dash against the rocks, sending up a shower of spray that quite covered me. I felt the pebbles rattling as the waves threw their ponderous weight against the shore. The whole beach seemed racked by their terrific onset, and the air throbbed with their pulsations. The breakers would swoop back to gather themselves for a mightier leap, and I clung to the rock, tense, fascinated, as I felt the dash and roar of the rushing sea." It is now known that verbal and non-linguistic creativity and the generation of ideas are all linked with specific dopamine pathways, particularly activity in the DRD2 gene. Ingesting drugs that boost dopamine activity can spark creativity, too. This happened to a woman with Parkinson's disease. Soon after she began to take L-Dopa, she became a remarkably talented poet. The ancient Greeks glorified this aspect of the explorer in the deity Dionysus. Dionysus was the god of the vine, the immortal who could bring you freedom, merriment, courage, and ecstatic joy, or brutality and ruin. Dionysus was also the god of inspiration, and to worship him, Athenians would assemble for a 5-day holiday in the spring, not in the surrounding forests or sacred temples, but in their theaters. Here they enjoyed inspiring plays, written in tribute to this muse. Mythologist Edith Hamilton wrote of these festivals, "The greatest poetry in Greece, and among the greatest in the world, was written for Dionysus, the god of creativity." Too much creativity? The Greeks also linked creativity with madness. They weren't far wrong. Very creative people tend to have more chemical imbalances, addictions, and mood disorders, and dopamine is regularly involved. This taint of blood, as poet Alfred Lord Tennyson described it, worried him all his life. 5 of his brothers, as well as his father, grandfather, both great-grandfathers, son, and grandson were manic depressives, a disorder of the dopamine system. Tennyson himself escaped this mania, yet reaped its fruit, abundant creativity. German composer Robert Schumann was less fortunate. Schumann brimmed with creativity when he was manic, but he rarely composed when gripped by one of his long depressions. Alas, he lost his battle with dopamine imbalance and died in an insane asylum. Schumann was not alone. When Kay Jamison examined the lives of 47 well-known British painters, sculptors, playwrights, and poets, she found that 30% had needed treatment for mood disorders, as opposed to 5% of the general population. Poets struggled the most. 50% of them needed considerable medical care. Human salvation lies in the hands of the creatively maladjusted, wrote Martin Luther King, Jr. Poets, playwrights, philosophers, artists, adventurers of all kinds have unquestionably improved the lives of millions with their creative gifts. Curiosity, the lust for knowing. Another hallmark of explorers is their curiosity. Helen Keller was enormously curious. From the moment she joined humanity at the water pump, she needed to know. As she wrote, I recall many incidents in the summer of 1887 that followed my soul's sudden awakening. I did nothing but explore with my hands and learn the name of every object that I touched. With time, Keller would read English, French, German, Greek, and Latin, travel to more than 39 countries, and study philosophy, history, the sciences, and literature. She loved to learn. Ever since the age of 7, she wrote, I have devoured everything in the shape of a printed page that has come into the reach of my hungry fingertips. Literature is my utopia. Explorers tend to have many interests. In my personality type study, explorers gave a particularly enthusiastic response to all 3 of these statements. I have a very wide range of interests. I am always doing new things. And my friends would say I'm very curious. Some explorers collect coins, comic books, or stamps. Some are walking encyclopedias of facts or tunes or figures. Some stroll regularly through the diverse neighborhoods of big cities, urban hiking. Some visit almost every country in the world. And many stay in school to learn. In the personality type study, the more education you had, the more likely you were to have a high score on the explorer scale. For lust of knowing what should not be known, we take the golden road to Samarkand, wrote poet James Elroy Flecker. Regardless of the cost, the time, the danger, or the hardship, explorers must know. When thinking about why Herodotus underwent such extreme hardships to write on the history and peoples of the ancient world, the Polish biographer Ryszard Kapuscinski wrote, I think it is simply curiosity about the world, the desire to be there, to see it at any cost, to experience it. Herodotus's curiosity gushed from a fountain of dopamine. Focusing with ease. Curiosity is biologically connected with another trait of the explorer, focused attention. Psychologists measure focus by the strength and persistence of your orienting reflex. This reflex comes in 3 varieties: initial focused attention, divided attention, and sustained attention. Explorers are poor at sustaining their attention, unless they are especially interested. But when these sensation seekers are first exposed to a new stimulus, they exhibit a strong initial orienting reflex. They focus their attention rapidly and earnestly. I'm not surprised. Dopamine helps you remember and prioritize salient data, as well as focus intensely. As a result, an explorer who is challenged at work or play can exhibit remarkable concentration. Explorers also excel at dividing their attention, a talent that reminds me of Bill, a pal from my days in graduate school. In the evening, this medical man used to settle down with a good book while he listened to both the radio and TV. It was chaos and cacophony to me, but periodically he calmly switched his intense attention from one stimulus to another. Specific genes in the dopamine system, DRD2 and DRD3, can be thanked for this agility at focusing short term. This relationship between dopamine and focused attention became clear to me one day at Rutgers University. I was riding the campus bus when I got into a conversation with one of my students. Our class was over, grades had been distributed, and I had a hunch that she trusted me. So I casually asked her what drugs students were taking these days to study. Ritalin, she replied. I wasn't surprised. Although I'm not in favor of using drugs to study, Ritalin activates the dopamine system in the brain, enabling one to concentrate, at least briefly. Motivation. Dopamine also promotes motivation and goal-oriented behaviors. It provides incentive. In fact, reduced dopamine activity in particular brain regions produces amotivation, a lack of desire. But in the right proportions, elevated dopamine activity is linked with enthusiasm, energy, focus, assertiveness, and the drive to achieve. As a result, most explorers want to make their mark in the theater, on the athletic field, with their novel, play, or poem, or in the political arena or business world. Helen Keller, for example, was absolutely determined to go to college. Nothing deterred her, not even the black silence that engulfed her. Oddly, this brain chemistry for motivation may also explain a related trait of many explorers, procrastination. Many explorers are so busy with their many interests that they simply don't focus on critical deadlines until the last hour. But there may be method to their madness. I, for example, rarely write a speech until the day before I deliver it. Sometimes I'm still composing as I hear myself being introduced. I don't enjoy these close calls, but I have long suspected that as my heart pounds and as I feel short of breath from panic, my feelings of danger and excitement are actually triggering a monsoon of dopamine in my brain, a flood that gives me energy, focus, and ideas. Adaptability, the salamander. It's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the ones most responsive to change, Charles Darwin wrote. Explorers would applaud this view. They're mentally flexible and adaptable. For example, explorer men and women usually hold permissive political, religious, and sexual views. They're more likely to be atheists or agnostics, and explorers are the least judgmental of the four types. Paracelsus, the Renaissance physician, referred to this type of person as a salamander, capable of changing its skin color to blend in with almost any environment. In fact, explorers are often good mimics. They can adopt different personas to appear just like those around them. They can also take criticism fairly easily. Explorers live in a world of live and let live. They are utilitarian, too. Explorers do what works. Theodore Roosevelt summed up the explorer's attitude saying, "Do what you can, with what you have, where you are." These men and women tend to remain cool in crises and act freely, rapidly, and tactically. Many even enjoy an emergency that requires them to work against the clock. Catastrophes give explorers energy, focus, and creativity. Autonomy. Don't let them tame you. Dopamine probably also contributes to the explorer's deep need for autonomy. Explorers are unconventional and nonconformist. Strict standards of conduct leave them cold. They're not bound by the rules and schedules of the builder, the logic of the director, or the ethical knots of the negotiator. Instead, they trust their impulses. Explorers launch into projects that appear impossible, make deals that seem sure to fail, and accept tasks that appear crazy to those around them. Choreographer Isadora Duncan encouraged this attitude in her dancers, saying, "You were once wild here. Don't let them tame you." Explorers often can't be tamed. Many see life as a crapshoot. When they fail, they are likely to just shrug it off, regarding their misfortune as an unlucky throw of the dice. They don't tend to moan about their losses, as builders do, dissect their blunders, as directors do, or worry about tomorrow's errors, as negotiators do. And because explorers can have superb timing and cleverly take advantage of their opportunities, they often win. Good manners are made up of petty sacrifices, wrote Ralph Waldo Emerson. Explorers prefer not to make sacrifices. Few see self-denial as a virtue. Instead, they want to be flexible, spontaneous, and free. Even schedules and routines annoy them, as my personality type study verified. When asked to respond to the statement, "I think consistent routines keep life orderly and relaxing," explorers scored far below other types. Flexibility, energy, creativity, restlessness, novelty-seeking, motivation. These traits tend to pay. Of the 4 basic personality types, explorers, both men and women, have the highest incomes. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. The old aphorism is true. Explorers often win big. Extravagant generosity. Explorers are generous, too. They value their friendships, at least when friends are interesting or suit their needs, and they can be extravagantly generous with them, often on the spur of the moment. Indeed, explorers are impulsive buyers. They purchase without planning ahead, a trait associated with dopamine. And many will also give the shirt off their back to help a friend or even a stranger. Helen Keller was certainly spontaneously generous. She was only 10 years old when her beloved dog Lioness was shot and killed by a sheriff enforcing the leash law in a nearby town square. Helen said with her fingers, "I'm sure they would never have done it if they had known what a dear, good dog Lioness was." This comment was reported in the local newspaper and soon printed by many others. Within days, Helen's devotees began to raise money to buy her a new pup. But she refused the gift, requesting instead that the money be given to help a 5-year-old deaf-blind boy in Pittsburgh. Optimism, a sunny personality. Galen, the Roman physician, called this personality type the sanguines to accentuate their extreme optimism. Of the 4 types, explorers are the most optimistic and enthusiastic, traits associated with dopamine. Low activity in dopamine circuits, on the other hand, is associated with anhedonia, the inability to experience physical and social pleasures. Pleasure means different things to different people, of course. Sensation seekers often derive pleasure from highly arousing experiences, while those who score low on sensation-seeking scales tend to derive pleasure from doing quieter things, often familiar activities with familiar friends. But ecstatic pleasure appears to derive, in large part, from dopamine. This is certainly what drives cocaine addicts to take their drug. Cocaine increases the activity of both dopamine and norepinephrine, but the euphoria, the high, comes from stimulating the brain's dopamine receptors, not those for norepinephrine. "Mirth with thee I mean to live," wrote poet John Milton. Most people want to be happy, but many explorers feel almost obliged to seek joy, particularly of the senses. Helen Keller, for instance, was driven to please her senses. One compelling incident in her childhood involved climbing a tree. Helen had been caught in a tree during a violent thunderstorm some weeks before, and the mere thought of climbing another, she wrote, filled me with terror. But one spring morning she smelled the perfume of mimosa blossoms, and she couldn't resist. I felt my way to the end of the garden, knowing that the mimosa tree was near the fence. Yes, there it was, all quivering in the warm sunshine, its blossom-laden branches almost touching the warm grass. I made my way through the shower of petals to the great trunk, and for 1 minute stood irresolute. Then, putting my foot in the broad space between the forked branches, I pulled myself up. I had a delicious sense that I was doing something unusual and wonderful, so I kept on climbing higher and higher. I sat there for a long time, feeling like a fairy on a rosy cloud. Like many explorers, Helen could not contain herself. She seized this opportunity to enjoy her senses. On the dark side, negative traits of the explorer. Philosopher Immanuel Kant once opined, "Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made." So it is with all of us. Explorers are energetic, restless, impulsive, creative, curious, original, generous, optimistic, autonomous, liberal, untraditional, daring, and interested in many things. But even appealing traits can turn sour. Some explorers are so irreverent, for example, that they appear cynical or glib. Because these men and women are independent-minded, they can, sometimes unwittingly, trample on the cherished rules and traditions of their relatives and friends. The desire for novelty and adventure can lead to philandering. They run from boredom, and as a consequence they can become narcissistic or reclusive when forced into tedious social schedules. Because explorers are so spontaneous, they can be unpredictable and unreliable, and their curiosity can override their sense of responsibility. I have a friend like this. He is almost always outrageously late. I've finally found out why. As he prepares to leave his house, a book, magazine, or newspaper catches his eye. With his insatiable curiosity, he picks it up, becomes absorbed, and loses track of time. Because he has little respect for schedules, and even less respect for those who abide by schedules, he's not motivated to be punctual either. Explorers also tend to be poor planners, perhaps because of their contempt for schedules. Explorers can be disorganized, too. They are likely to have piles of paper around their desk at work, and books, magazines, sports equipment, and other artifacts of their interest scattered on their bedroom floor, on the back seat of their car, even in their purse and pockets. This has a silver lining, of course. As British writer A. A. Milne put it, one of the advantages of being disorderly is that one is constantly making exciting discoveries. As you might expect, disorderliness is associated with dopamine. Some will also find fault with the explorer's lack of introspection. Perhaps due to their intense curiosity about the world around them, explorers seldom indulge in self-analysis. They look out, not in. So explorers can appear emotionally shallow, particularly to negotiators who are highly introspective. Explorers can also lack the loyalty of the builder, the directness of the director, and the sympathy of the negotiator. Explorers can be aggressive, in part because dopamine triggers testosterone and suppresses serotonin, thus creating a cocktail for hostility. Explorers also tend to divorce more regularly than other types. Psychoanalyst Erich Fromm was probably right when he proposed that this personality type has a tendency to be opportunistic. Explorers tend to score low on 4 of 6 major components of agreeableness: altruism, compliance, modesty, and straightforwardness. They score only slightly higher on trust and tender-mindedness, and explorers can be devious as they maneuver to stay one step ahead of anyone who would divert them from their goals. Explorers live in the here and now. They travel fast, and if you can't keep up, they go alone. Their motto, carpe diem, seize the day. Possible physical problems. I suspect that explorers are prone to specific mental diseases, particularly manic depressive illness, now called bipolar disorder. Psychiatrist Kay Jamison's struggle with bipolar illness began during high school, due to an imbalance in dopamine activity, and by age 28, as a new assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of California, Los Angeles, she was on her way to raw insanity. In her book, she describes one evening outside the hospital where she worked. I was on the run. Not just on the run, but fast and furious on the run, darting back and forth across the hospital parking lot, trying to use up a boundless, restless, manic energy. I was running fast, but slowly going mad. Eventually, lithium, a drug that suppresses dopamine circuits, saved her life. Explorers can also suffer from various addictions, including alcohol abuse, drug addiction, and/or gambling. As a conservative businessman in his 50s discovered when he began to take a medication for Parkinson's disease, L-Dopa. L-Dopa elevates dopamine activity. And soon after he began his daily regimen, this formerly self-controlled man gambled away his family savings. He also searched the internet until he found his high school sweetheart and began menacing her with sexual demands. Impulsiveness, elevated sexuality, and gambling have been reported so often among Parkinson's patients taking medications that trigger dopamine activity that clinicians are now being advised to warn them of these potential side effects. Of course, though, not all explorers are cynical, narcissistic, unpredictable, unsympathetic, disorganized, Machiavellian, or perpetually aggressive. Few suffer from bipolar illness or addiction either. Instead, many are energetic, witty, spontaneous, optimistic, original, and generous, and have many interests and ideas. Moreover, explorers' secondary traits always add to their personality. Explorer negotiators can be very nurturing and intuitive. Explorer builders can be exceedingly loyal and organized, and explorer directors can be forthright. The explorer in youth and middle age. I circle around the boundaries of the earth, wearing my long-winged feathers as I fly. This Navajo shamanic song captures the core of the young explorer, particularly men. Young explorer men score much higher than young women on the more physical forms of exploration, getting thrills from skydiving, skiing treacherous black diamond trails, spelunking, or diving off cliffs into pools far below. This youthful male craving for physical adventure may be due to the relationship between dopamine and testosterone. These chemicals trigger each other. This chemical partnership also explains why men are particularly physically adventurous in their late teens when testosterone levels peak and elevate dopamine activity, as well as why their appetite for physical thrills declines with age as testosterone levels decline, lowering dopamine activity. But women in their teens and 20s are just as eager to chase new adventures of the mind and senses, especially stimulating music and visual arts, drugs, and the intellectual and social fringes, such as palm reading, radical politics, or avant-garde healing practices. The lust for action-adventure declines with age in both men and women as levels of dopamine decrease. But older sensation seekers continue their exploration by reading, traveling, going to the theater, movies, music, or other arts events, collecting memorabilia, or pursuing other creative ways of satisfying their restless spirits. Moreover, middle-aged women begin to score higher than men in overall sensation seeking. They buy more books, and they support the travel and leisure industry, cajoling their partners to accompany them to the Great Wall of China, Victoria Falls, Patagonia, or myriad local cultural events. Middle-aged explorers of both sexes also keep up with their friends, often other explorers. In my personality type study, builders consorted with a social crowd, directors fraternized with intellectuals, and negotiators mixed with activists. Explorers, however, befriended people like themselves, adventurers. Scientists report that we tend to choose our friends according to our genetically based temperament. All 4 types in the personality type study certainly support this proposition. Born free. Search. Always go on searching. These were among Leo Tolstoy's last words to his followers on his deathbed. Explorers do search. They are born free. They want to think out of the box, rock the boat, make waves, court danger, keep an open mind, and seize the day. No one is a pure explorer, of course. We are all a boundless mix of genes, chemicals, and experiences that make each of us unique. But Helen Keller captures the soul of the explorer with her description of rowing. Sometimes I go rowing without a rudder. It's fun to try to steer by the scent of watergrasses and lilies, and of bushes that grow on the shore. I like to contend with wind and rains. What is more exhilarating than to make your staunch little boat go skimming lightly over glistening, tilting waves? Explorers drink life. Chapter 5. Be faithful to that which exists nowhere but in yourself, and thus make yourself indispensable. André Gide. A pillar of society, the builder. I was in a trendy hotel rooftop bar, the Beach, when I saw my first builder in courting action. The evening was in full swing. Some 200 singles were clustered at the long Hawaiian tiki bar, standing around the 2 cabanas in the fire pit, or sprawled on the gleaming white sand that stretched from one corner of the rooftop to the other, all beneath the cobalt firmament and surrounded by the towering glass buildings of downtown San Diego. It was a sandbox in the sky, a perfect setting for a singles event. San Diego Magazine was hosting this adventure in conjunction with Chemistry.com. And there I was. The evening would be a challenge. The MC was screaming into the microphone, announcing the beginning of the evening entertainment, a mini version of the dating game. 2 journalists from a local television station, a female weather broadcaster, and a male sports anchor had been invited to participate, and both were waiting in the wings. The plan was simple. First, the female weather broadcaster would perch on a high stool in the right cabana, while 3 eligible bachelors sat on stools in the left one. A curtain would isolate the woman from the 3 men, but the crowd could see all participants. My mission? To watch the verbal exchange as the female weather broadcaster asked the 3 bachelors several questions, and then to explain to the largely inebriated crowd why she chose the man she chose for a date that night. I had been told only one thing about this woman. She was primarily an explorer and secondarily a negotiator. Out traipsed the weather anchor as the singles sipped their Blue Goose cocktails and cheered. She began. "How would you ride me if I were a surfboard?" she queried bachelor number 1. I braced myself. The crowd roared. Bachelor number 1 was slow to answer, mulling over the question. He's lost already, I mused. Explorers like quick repartee. Bachelor number 2 responded next with something slick. But explorers are not impressed with slick, partly because they can be slick themselves and can spot it fast in others. Moreover, Bachelor number 2 lacked the warmth and authenticity that I felt would appeal to her negotiator streak. Then Bachelor number 3 responded. "First I'd get you wet," he said. The crowd went wild. He's won, I thought. Explorers tend to be sexy because dopamine activates testosterone, the hormone of sexual desire, and this guy had flair. Bachelor number 3 then delivered a playful rant about catching her on a wave and riding her tenderly until she peaked. Now the audience was howling, and I became sure I knew her choice. Bachelor number 3 had mixed spontaneous and unpredictable bawdiness with genuine care, playing directly to the explorer's need for excitement and the negotiator's need for authenticity. I was right. She chose Bachelor number 3. That was a relief. My understanding of her biology had not let me down, but I had more to do. Next would be the male sports anchor, a builder. I suspected he would be relaxed, social, interested in home and family, community-oriented, conscientious, and cautious, as builders tend to be. Moreover, builders take dating seriously. They are not amused by those who appear devious, grandiose, or falsely sexual. So I had a hunch that this man would choose the bachelorette who was the most down-to-earth. In sauntered the male TV anchor. The 3 bachelorettes took their seats. First he asked each woman to say hello. The crowd was riveted. Bachelorette number 2 topped her with "Hello, baby." The crowd swayed and sighed. Then Bachelorette number 3 said, "Hi." No frills, no thrills. Her salutation was short and formal. I had a hunch that she would be the one. An explorer would have been put off by her lack of playfulness. A negotiator would have sought more warmth. A director would have dismissed her as too conventional. But a builder might be enticed. Builders are traditional. Bachelorettes number 1 and number 2 continued to respond to his queries with quick, self-revealing, sexually spiced remarks, while Bachelorette number 3 maintained her reserve. Eventually, Cupid worked his work, and the sports anchor chose Bachelorette number 3. To my relief, I had pegged the preferences of both TV anchors. In fact, I still wonder whether this second pair eventually fell in love. I say this because after the event, I explained to Bachelorette number 3 that her builder date was likely to be a man of honor, duty, and loyalty. Hearing me, he leaned toward her and whispered, "It's true." Serotonin's magic. Of the nearly 40,000 anonymous people I surveyed in my personality type study, 28% were builders. Of these, 27% were men and 29% were women, a slight but mathematically significant difference. These men and women share many traits. Builders tend to be loyal and conscientious. Duty, respectability, and proper moral conduct are particularly important to them. Builders are also conventional. They admire and follow social norms and customs. They respect authority, follow rules, and enjoy making plans and keeping schedules. They think concretely. Builders are often literal, detail-oriented, and orderly, as well as cautious but not fearful. They tend to be social, and builders are generally superb at managing people, at work, in the family, and in their various social circles. Although the sports television anchor may have known these things about himself, he undoubtedly did not know what produced these traits. Serotonin, the mother of all neurotransmitters, the oldest of them all. Serotonin has extensive pathways in the brain. You inherit your basic activities of this chemical. However, your experiences can alter this thermostat to some degree. And as this chemical floods, lingers, and recedes from various brain regions, it affects your attitudes and behavior. No brain system acts alone, of course. Serotonin, for instance, can elevate estrogen levels in brain regions that influence thinking, emotion, and memory. Serotonin can also trigger the release of oxytocin, a chemical associated with trusting and the ability to figure out others' states of mind. So all three of these chemicals probably contribute to the builder's affability, their deep need to attach to family and community, and their tact and managerial skills. Moreover, serotonin can suppress testosterone activity, particularly in the brain center associated with fear, anger, and aggression, the amygdala. This may be why, in part, builders tend to be calm and self-confident. Their serotonin is suppressing aggressive tendencies. Last, serotonin suppresses dopamine activity. And as you recall, dopamine often produces impulsive recklessness. Hence, it is likely that by reducing dopamine activity, serotonin generates the builder's caution. In short, serotonin has myriad interactions with other brain chemicals. Nevertheless, serotonin is central to the mindset of the builder. Respect for authority and loyalty. A builder par excellence was George Washington, the first president of the United States, a national symbol almost as powerful as the American flag. Washington had just the right mix of traits to lead the American rebels to victory, then fashion a new nation. Foremost, Washington was a superb military man. As a young man, he had served with distinction in the Virginia militia during the French and Indian War. Like the builders in my personality type study, he respected authority and was able to work effectively within a social hierarchy. Washington was also loyal, another core trait of the builder associated with serotonin. We all inherit some degree of loyalty, of course, and we learn the benefits of allegiance, but explorers are devoted to their experiences. Directors are dedicated to their work, and negotiators tend to be devoted to family, people, and ideas. Builders, on the other hand, often feel a special obligation to the larger community. Builders see loyalty as duty. Washington certainly did. Fighting at Lexington and Concord had produced the shot heard round the world, and when Washington appeared at the meeting of the Second Continental Congress in May 1775, he was wearing his military uniform, a sign of his respect, allegiance to the American cause, and willingness to serve in the Revolution. Washington did not wish to become commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He was a modest man who had already resigned once from the military and was fully absorbed in developing his beloved estate, Mount Vernon. But Washington believed he had to contribute, and when his comrades elected him to lead American soldiers into battle, he felt it was his duty to accept this assignment. Orderliness, the rule keepers. Washington was also orderly. Builders pride themselves on being orderly, another trait associated with an active serotonin system. In my personality type study, builders responded far more enthusiastically than the other types to the statement, "Taking care of my possessions is a high priority for me." Builders are also orderly in their daily routines. Before builders embark on a special job at work, they organize themselves, often breaking down the assignment into steps. They like to follow a prescribed process. They don't like unpredictability or working under pressure. Even on weekends, builders are likely to make lists of what they want to do, as well as arrange their social engagements well in advance. Builders also like rules, a trait that probably stems from their biological need for order. When asked to respond to the statement, "In general, I think it's important to follow rules," builders in my personality type study were far more likely than other types to strongly agree. Washington liked rules. Every morning of the war, after prayers, he would read the day's orders to his regiments. Sometimes he even authorized lashes for those who failed to act according to the rules. He even discharged some officers for straying off the path of good conduct, saying, "I spare none." It's not surprising that builders such as Washington and many others would gravitate to the military or to government jobs, law enforcement, major corporations, or rules committees. Builders feel comfortable in hierarchies where duty and loyalty are required and where structure, rules, and order reign. The plan, routine, and schedule makers. A strong preference for careful planning is another trait of the builder. In my personality type study, builders stood out in their agreement with the statement, "I enjoy planning way ahead." My friend Sarah is a consummate planner. Weeks in advance, she plans almost every hour of her next trip to London. She buys tickets online to musical events, makes restaurant reservations, and knows the opening and closing hours of the museum she will attend. She says she likes making the plans as much as she likes following them. What would be cloying to an explorer, impractical to a director, and regarded as inflexible to a negotiator, is relaxing to builders like Sarah. Their logistical capabilities are supreme. Builders also like schedules and routines. I learned this one evening some 25 years ago. That morning I made plans with Charles, a friend of mine, to amble from his apartment in New York's Soho neighborhood to a tiny Spanish restaurant in the West Village, El Faro. It was a 20-minute stroll, but as we prepared to depart, the sky turned black and it began to pour, a deluge that the local TV news station promised would last several hours. So I suggested that we dine somewhere closer. His reply? "But we said we would go to El Faro." Habit is stronger than reason, wrote philosopher George Santayana. This need to stick to plans, methods, and habits has been associated with serotonin and is a hallmark of the builder. Only the builders in my personality type study heartily agreed with the statement, "I think consistent routines keep life orderly and relaxing." In fact, because builders like to meet their deadlines in an organized, structured, and timely way, interruptions and diversions can irritate them. Their goal is closure. They want things to be resolved, settled. Precision in details, step thinking. His respect for authority, his loyalty to his cause, his taste for order, and his need to follow rules and make plans and schedules probably all helped George Washington do his duty. But he shared another trait with most builders. He was precise and detail-oriented. As one of his comrades in arms wrote of him, method and exactness are the forte of his character. At Mount Vernon, for example, Washington meticulously arranged his flower garden and vegetable plots, his hedges and paths, his lawns and shrubs. Even the way he spaced his words on a page had to be perfect. And although he refused a salary for his job as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, he promised to keep an exact account of his expenses. To builders, details matter. These people remember people's names, the birthdays of friends and relatives, details about neighbors and colleagues, and the exact date, time, and location of specific family or community affairs. I suspect that many of the men and women who send Christmas letters that diligently recount the details of the year's doings are builders. This precision is associated with high serotonin activity. Builders must be organized and accurate, too. They are process-oriented. They like to pursue specific goals in a precise, consistent, sequential, linear, step-by-step way, what I call step thinking. In my personality type study, only builders heartily agreed with the statement, "I like to work in a straightforward path toward completing the task." Even in their everyday speech, builders tend to impart their thoughts accurately, precisely, and completely, providing all of the relevant information. If you interrupt them, finish their sentences for them, or ask questions that appear superfluous, A builder is likely to think you're not interested or not listening. To them, tangents and side conversations are frustrating distractions. Samuel Johnson once said, "A good conversation is a series of interruptions." Builders would not agree. Their jokes also reflect their need for order, predictability, precision, and closure. Builders don't tend to like incongruous humor, unresolved humor, or nonsense humor. They prefer jokes and stories that are concrete and resolved, a taste in humor that has been linked to the activity of serotonin. Persistence and patience. Shortly after the War of Independence, Washington was overwhelmingly elected America's first president. He was dismayed, having long dreamed of returning to his beloved Mount Vernon to be a gentleman farmer. But, ever dutiful, he accepted the job in order to finish the work he had started, constructing a new country. Washington was persistent and patient, more builder traits associated with serotonin activity. I recently witnessed this persistence in a bookstore. I had purchased several books as birthday presents. The saleswoman wrapped my gifts with what I regarded as unnecessary precision. I was impatient to go, but she could not finish her task until every angle of the wrapping and every pattern of the paper was perfectly aligned. I even remarked to her, "You're so patient." She replied, "I was born that way." My strength lies solely in my tenacity, declared chemist Louis Pasteur. Builders are persistent and patient, indeed tenacious, in part because they can tolerate repetition. They are not easily bored, so they excel at tasks requiring sustained attention and repetition. Interestingly, repetitive actions even raise levels of serotonin. This may be why some people repeat an action over and over when they're anxious, like checking to see if they've turned off the stove or rummaging through their suitcase to be sure they've packed all they need for a vacation. As they repeat these motions, they could be unconsciously triggering serotonin activity in the brain, reducing anxiety. Builders may also be relieving anxiety when they doodle. When members of Chemistry.com selected from an assortment of doodles the ones that they were most likely to execute, the builders chose grids and repetitive designs. This result supports research on serotonin, showing that the builder type gravitates to symmetrical designs, particularly pyramids, crosses, and other geometric shapes that shout simplicity, order, predictability, and repetition. Remarkably, men and women who express serotonin activity, whom psychologist Marvin Zuckerman calls low sensation seekers, also have a taste for geometry in their clothing. As Zuckerman reported, for some unfathomable reason, low sensation-seeking males seemed to favor plaid sports shirts. Could today's golfers who wear plaid pants and hunters who don plaid shirts be unconsciously advertising their temperament with their clothing? In effect, saying, "Trust me, I'm orderly, predictable, and loyal. I'm a builder."